And I'm going to start by claiming, rather than arguing, but claiming that we have now won the intellectual argument for a post-colonial, decolonial, southern-oriented global social science. But the institutions are slow to change. Farid made the point that we've now had 2 generations of critical analysis of these problems and arguing for a change in the social sciences, but we're still in the situation where the global north and its elite institutions especially very much are the centre of attention and able to define agendas and methods. Could I have the first picture, please? Many of you have seen this before, but for those who don't, this is a map of the world where countries are shown in a size proportional to the number of research journals they publish in all fields of knowledge put together. And it's a fairly dramatic demonstration of the dominance of certain parts of the world, particularly the Anglophone North, United States and Britain, followed by the rest of Europe, put together with the rest of the world very, very far behind. So that situation still, is still what we face. And the question that I start with, therefore, is what do we now do in practice to advance the cause of a globally inclusive and more democratic social science? What then would our next move be in attempting to move towards a genuinely global social theory? One thing we have to do is get a bit of clarity about what theory is. And my argument is that theory should be understood as one moment in a larger process of the production of circulation of knowledge. It is, if you like, a moment in the making of knowledge, one which involves specific form of intellectual labour. And the labour of theorising does, I think, 3 things in the process of producing knowledge. First of all, it links experiences, it links pieces of data, it connects the materials in the production of knowledge. Secondly, it's labour that attempts to identify patterns in the materials. And thirdly, it's labour that goes beyond the existing knowledge and existing understanding of patterns. So there's always an element of imagination, of going beyond the given in theorising as an intellectual practice. Now, part of the problem we face, in fact, I think a very considerable part of the problem that we face in the politics of knowledge, that in the contemporary global economy of knowledge, the economy in which these practices exist, there is a geopolitical location of these theoretical practices, these particular types of practices that we call theory. And that labour is predominantly located in the global metropole. Could I have the next picture, please? This is an argument which was, in my experience at least, first and most forcefully made by Pauline Ntonji from Benin in West Africa. Certainly he's the person from whom I learnt to understand the geopolitical division of labour within the larger project of producing organised knowledge. That's, if you like, an example of the issue that we came up against in the first session today of how to define the North, or as it's usually put, how to define the South. Farid argues for taking a relational view of these concepts, with which I completely agree. And this is one example of it, that we understand that relationship in terms of a division of labour within the knowledge production process. And from that point of view, an important consequence follows, even for our language in talking about these problems. In the sort of global discussions of decolonizing the curriculum or sort of centre and periphery in the world of knowledge, it's very common to speak of the mainstream epistemological system as Western science or Western knowledge. And in the light of what I've just been saying, the crucial point is that this was never just Western, that modern science, natural sciences, social sciences, the whole, in effect, the whole dominant knowledge system that we work in or around has always been imperial science, in which very large parts of the data that went to constitute sciences like astronomy, biology, and so forth came actually from the colonized world, from the global periphery, and was organized through this division of labor, with theoretical labor occurring principally in the metropole. Could we have the next picture, please? This is an illustration of that process. This is the ship, the British naval ship Beagle, which spent about 3 years sailing around the world, principally around South America, but then in the Pacific and Indian Oceans, carrying with it as its most important cargo an observer who was collecting scientific data, one Charles Darwin, who then took the data back to the metropole, integrated it with knowledge and theorizing there, and produced modern evolutionary biology. This relationship is as important as that. It's actually formative of crucial moves in the development of modern knowledge systems. So I would argue then that we actually need a world sociology of knowledge, a concrete sociology of knowledge production processes. And part of what I've tried to do in the paper is to set out some of the key concepts that would be useful in such a sociology. Now, I'm going to skip right over this at the moment. I apologise for in the paper, I linger too much on this issue, I now think. I was trying to build up the concepts of the intellectual labour process, point to some of the dominant institutions in which the labour of knowledge production occurs, and above all, propose the concept of an intellectual workforce, of the actual group of people who do the principal work of collating data, theorising, circulating, disseminating, and applying knowledge. I think it's really important to think about the problems we're dealing with in this symposium in terms of the workforces involved. They are necessarily complex. There are divisions of labour within the intellectual workforce itself, which I won't linger on now. But I do argue that it's important to always to be thinking of the workforce when we're talking about knowledge systems or changes in knowledge. When we're talking about epistemes, we are talking about the collective products of intellectual labour forces. And when we're talking about forms of knowledge produced or appropriated in the colonised or post-colonial world, we're also talking about the work of workforces of particular kinds. It's important, and it's easier once we take that point, that starting point, I think, to understand that the knowledge formations created by intellectual labour forces, intellectual workforces, are in fact never static. That they are not, something that is constructed and then given as a cultural constant in any historical circumstance. This too is a point made by Untonji. In fact, in his first famous book, the one translated into English as On African Philosophy, where he criticised a whole genre of talk about African philosophy, which had purported to uncover philosophical doctrines and standpoints in the folk culture of colonised African societies. And Ntonji argued, I think, with very considerable force, that this way of understanding knowledge as static, homogeneous, unanimous, culturally unanimous, is in fact a colonial gaze, the product of a colonial gaze on colonised cultures and peoples. If we take instead the starting point, as the starting point, the colonial encounter, then we begin to understand the great dynamism of the production of knowledge in the colonised and post-colonial world, far from static. If I could have the next picture. And
you wanted a note at 10?
Okay, thank you. Hence my interest in figures like Ali Shariati, who produced extraordinarily interesting and moving interplay between Islam, the Shiite version, of course, and forms of knowledge that he had appropriated from European circles. The dynamism of knowledge formation in the periphery, of course, is also very much connected to the social movements that arise there and their demands for knowledge and their critiques of existing forms of culture. The next picture, please. That's the reason for an interest in people like Sol Plaatje in South Africa, the figure who was secretary of the predecessor of the African National Congress, in fact, who has shown actually in a research process, in a knowledge production process, where he travelled the country by bicycle, researching the experience of black families who had been displaced by the settler government's Native Land Act of 1913, a crucial step in the gradual construction of the apartheid regime. And that, I think, is exemplary of the connection between social movements and knowledge making, which we also see with independence movements, women's movements, and labour movements as well. Now, if we think, primarily in the, if you like, in the category of encounter as a crucial concept for understanding our issues, we can see fairly easily how this generates new agendas for the intellectual labour of linking different experiences together, of seeing patterns in experiences and information, and of going beyond the existing given, which is, of course, my definition of what theory is. So the notion of new agendas for theory comes very directly out of this kind of conception. I've been engaged for the last 20 years or so, on occasion, going around American campuses, arguing for post-colonial Southern perspectives in the social sciences. And a very typical question I'm asked, in fact, the most usual question I'm asked on those occasions is, if we go and study these exotic characters like Shariati and Ntonji, that word exotic I've actually heard in such a situation, what will it add to what we already know? Now that question itself, contains a whole politics of knowledge and priority, of course, but it is a question that can be answered because the encounters that I've been talking about do, in fact, generate, very significantly changed agendas for what social science should be about, should be concerned with, and trying to generate knowledge around. Now here I'll go very fast, but I want to point to the importance, for instance, of land. Can I have the next picture, please? Social movement in the south, the Movimento Sem Terra in Brazil, the Landless Peoples Movement, which problematises the role of land in the power structures and economy of Brazil. If you look very closely at that picture, you'll see something very significant, which is that all the people in this demonstration are women. So it's also a demonstration about women's social presence and social rights. And that, of course, if I can have the next picture, is exactly the point taken up in magnificent research in India by Beena Agarwal, feminist economist of enormous note, in her great book, A Field of One's Own, which I think is one of the great classics of modern feminism. Also stories, problems to be raised about the state, a topic of Northern theory, of course, but one which has to be rethought in decolonial and post-colonial perspectives, reading states not just as nation states, but as empires, seeing the constitutive role of violence in the creation of empires, and I might say in the creation of the neoliberal world. So when we come to Manuela Boatka's paper, we'll see some of this rethinking going on as she addresses the necessary rethinking of Europe itself as a place in the light of post-colonial perspectives. A third theme is the new dynamics of patriarchy, which have to be reread in the light of coloniality and the violence of colonialism. Can I have the next picture, please? One of the most original pieces of work in the era of women's liberation is the book by Helena Safiotti in Brazil, which actually came out before the classics of women's liberation in the North, and produced a colonial and historical perspective on the oppression of women, which I think is still remarkably relevant. And the next picture, please. Or we could think in the following generation of Amina Mama, important feminist thinker from Africa, who's argued in analysing gender-based violence in Africa that we must read the contemporary levels of violence and forms of violence in the light of the violence of colonialism itself. And finally, we have to think of the, again, categories that are classic in Northern theory of power and exploitation, but we have to think these in new ways when we're thinking globally. We have to think of the new centres of global power, the way global power moves and is currently actually moving offshore in the form of transnational corporations and global markets and the transnational state, and new forms of exploitation, because neoliberalism means something very significantly different in the global south from what it means in the global north. Though social theory addressing neoliberalism is mainly centred on northern thinkers and northern experience, and assumed wrongly that neoliberalism was then spread from the north to the global south. In fact, if anything, it began in the south. Another story. Okay, well, those are examples of how social science has to change, needs to change. New agendas need to be pursued as we begin to realise the power of post-colonial perspectives. Well, at this point in the paper, I then start talking about some of the practical steps in remaking social science, decolonising the curriculum, thinking about the formation of new workforces and so forth. I'm going to skip right over that because we've already discussed that in Farid Alatas's paper this morning, and I think he actually did that better than I did, so we can come back to that in discussion if you'd like. But I want to finish by suggesting something of the political urgency of the post-colonial Southern decolonial project, doing social science in the mode of decoloniality. Because I want to pose the question of what the alternative is. What's going to be the future of social science if we do not carry through this conceptual revolution? I think in a world dominated by neoliberal regimes and a neoliberal economy, the future fate of social science is very largely marginalisation, of becoming a science of the losers, so to speak, aiding the powers of the neoliberal world to manage the marginal. In a world that's dominated by authoritarian nationalism, which seems to be coming into existence, perhaps as a response to neoliberalism, perhaps as a new form of it, the future of social science is likely to be of defensiveness. There's no particular place for social science, especially a critical social science, in the world of Donald Trump. So, basically, the dominant powers of our world have no need of good theory. But those movements, groups, and people who are struggling against these powers do have need of good theory. And that, I guess, is my, a core of my concern for work in this area. In the last few days, India has been celebrating the memory of Bhimrao Ramji Ambedkar, a great figure in the foundation of the independent Indian state. That's the centre of the public celebration, as I understand it. But Ambedkar was also a great figure in struggles for social justice, important nationally and important, I think, internationally. And it's those, when we think of theory, I want, if you like, to move our fundamental point of reference. Can I have the next picture, please? That's just Southern neoliberalism. The next picture, please. Away from our concern with what is, in fact, a historical fiction of the northern founding fathers in the social sciences. If I could have the next picture, please. To the social movements that are struggling for social justice in the contemporary world. That, I think, fundamentally is what our theory should be speaking to. Thank you. Okay.
Well, thank you so much for that, Raewyn, and thank you for the paper, which I found incredibly interesting. And in a way, we've had a various sort of forms of conversation about these themes over the last few years, whether via publication or at conferences and seminars. So I guess some of these questions will be returning to some of the conversations we've had in the past. I think, in part, one of the issues that comes up for me initially when reading the paper and hearing your comments now is really the question of knowledge production and how that in itself is conceptualized. So in a sense, there's a particular way in which we understand the production of knowledge in terms of how knowledge is produced in various parts in the world. And this was one of the things that came up, as you were mentioning in Fried's talk earlier, about the need to discover or rediscover lost voices in other places, and the sort of focus that you have also on recovering the thought of thinkers that might be regarded as either being located in peripheral locations or being peripheral in terms of what we understand the sort of theoretical canon to be, and so on. And then for me, there's another way of thinking about the production of knowledge, which is also about the way in which the knowledge that's produces the world. It configures the world. So it's not just knowledge produced in the world, but it's knowledge that produces the world. And I guess in a sense, that form of knowledge is most often understood in terms of a grand narrative, that the grand narrative is a history of the way in which the world has come to be configured, but it also goes on to produce particular ways of the way in which we understand the world to be as well. And for me, there's a tension between the two, in part because I don't think it's sufficient simply to accumulate. I think it's important to also do the task of recovery and retrieval that you talk about in terms of locating these other thinkers and the knowledges that come from other places and so on. But in itself, it's not sufficient if what it doesn't do is deconstruct the grand narrative that otherwise produces the world as modern in particular sorts of ways. So it's about locating, or it's about, for me, thinking about the way in which these scholars have been ignored. What are the ways in which they've been left out of the canon, and what would the process of including them back into the canon consist of? And I'm using canon here, in the sense of if we're talking about knowledge production in institutions, then that's always an organized form of knowledge production that includes and excludes. And so changing those that we engage with would change the way in which we might think about the world itself. So I was just struck in the last example as well, you counterpose Marx, Weber, Durkheim with social movements. But obviously what's forgotten there is the contribution made by Du Bois, who many have argued is the founder of modern sociology, given that the insights that he establishes in very particular ways in the US are what get taken up by the Chicago School, albeit without citation and without acknowledgement. I mean, Robert Park's work on race and the urban is taken entirely from Du Bois's earlier work, and yet he's effaced within the genealogies of sociology. So in a way, there's a continual evasion of engaging with those figures who have been central to the production of the discipline of sociology in that sort of elision. So I think it's important for us to acknowledge those broader genealogies that already exist and have been displaced, ignored, sidelined, and dismissed, and so on, and think about how that would enable us to think about a different sort of sociology in the present. I've got more questions, but perhaps if you might want to...
Sure, yeah. I'm not, I think, at odds with you on this. I've also done a little bit of the critique of the familiar canon, tried to show in a preliminary way at least how it came into existence and what were the problems in Northern discipline at the time that led to the construction of that particular, as I regard it, mythological story. And part of that critique, and a very powerful part of that critique, is recovering other knowledge producers or thinkers within the global north who have been marginalised for fairly obvious reasons. In Du Bois' case, not only because he was black, but also because he became, or was thought to be, and possibly became a communist, and thus fell foul of more than one form of repression. Similarly, with the attempt by American sociology to recover founding mothers of the discipline, who are now very often referred to in chapter 1 of the introductory textbook alongside the founding fathers. So I'm entirely sympathetic to that kind of work, but I don't think it is in itself a complete project, a sufficient project, if we're not also understanding the exclusions that have operated at the same time on the global level, such as the erasure, if you like, of the colonial element in what came to be called Western science, which is quite a spectacular erasure, or the tendency to forget the significance of social movements and, to use that contested word, subaltern groups, in the generation of the ideas which were then attached to leading intellectuals, such as Marx. Labour theory of value, for instance, came directly from working class movements in England in the 1830s and 40s, were then taken up and formalised by Marx. They actually came from the social struggles. Yeah, I want all of those to be part of our historical critique, for sure.
I mean, to what extent? Because I think, you start off in a very optimistic mode in the paper where you talk about the fact that the conceptual critique of the coloniality of social science is now firmly established. And in a sense, you don't go into that. But I would argue, in a sense, what evidence is there that the conceptual critique of the coloniality of social science is firmly established? Because, I mean, in a sense, thinking about it in the context of the UK, there's been the Rhodes Must Fall movement, which drew its inspiration, obviously, from the South African movement, but we had a movement there in Oxford. There's been a movement to decolonize SOAS, where students and staff have sought to rethink the curriculum. I mean, for example, they have a module on world philosophies, and they argued that this module on world philosophies ought not only to focus on white male European philosophers. And there was such a backlash. The entire media establishment came out against them for suggesting that perhaps you might, in a course on world philosophies, also include philosophers from other parts of the world. So I would suggest that there's a very hostile, very disproportionate pushback. Every time I've ever made an argument about coloniality, modernity, I always get asked, well, what isn't Europe special? You know, and that isn't only within Europe, but around most of the world. There's this sense that there's an agreement on a narrative of modernity that associates it with Europe and then subsequently disseminates to the rest of the world. And I don't think that that has been unsettled sufficiently.
I'd agree with you at one level and not at another. I've had the same kind of experience, I might say, when I've sort of argued for the narrowness of a conception of, for instance, social theory in some Australian forums. I've been told to pull my head in. But what I'm trying to suggest is that we have won the intellectual argument, but not yet the practical argument, if you like. And to say we've won the intellectual argument is certainly a personal judgment, but I have not actually seen a convincing refutation of what you've been arguing, of what I've been arguing, of what Julian Goa has been arguing in the United States. There's rejection, certainly, and there's ignoring of it, but not an actual successful counter-argument to show that it's wrong. I think it's right, and I wanted to, therefore, if you like, to start with that form of encouragement, to say we've actually got somewhere intellectually, but there's a huge practical problem that remains. The institutions haven't changed, and they generate that kind of backlash. Exactly.
But in a sense, isn't that the issue? You know, in a sense,
well,
even
yeah,
if there's
that's
no
right.
refutation,
So what do we do
things
then?
continue as normal.
Yeah, that's right. So then what do we do in practice is indeed the problem. Yeah.
Okay. I mean, I had a couple of other sort of questions, because I guess one thing is thinking about the very project of Southern theory, or theory for a global South, or the various phrases with which we might sort of think about these things. And sometimes it seems that the debate is often focused in terms of a wish to reclaim an authentic past. And then the counter-argument is always, well, you can't reclaim an authentic past because of the intervening years. There's no authentic past to be reclaimed, and that, in a sense, denies the very project of doing Southern theory. And it seems like a diversion from the work that actually needs to be done to be stuck in that sort of debate. And I mean, that was just a sort of a reflection in terms of having read your paper. That wasn't obviously what you were arguing, but it just made me think that the work that needs to be done is more future-oriented than thinking about these issues in relation to some idea of authenticity and what that sort of...
I was rather surprised when I first ran into that reaction, because I thought the people I'd been talking about, and that most of this discussion was talking about, were very far from backward looking. I mean, they were talking about the world that they lived in and how to change it and where it might go and how to mobilise the resources that existed in marginalised cultures or conquered peoples to do that, to create a new world. But, you know, reflecting on it, I have to say the critique does bite with certain versions of a claim for, as you say, authentic knowledge. Certain simplified versions of indigenous knowledge positions can be very backward-looking, exclusionary. Again, I mean, he is a bit of a hero of mine. This is something that Udonji said some time ago in his critique of the African knowledge the African Philosophy Project, that we are at risk of constructing imaginary pasts or imaginarily unanimous cultures and claiming that as authentic, in this case African, but the same thing might happen in any other situation where an indigenous knowledge claim could be made. That's perhaps sort of coming to realise that risk is why I've wanted to emphasise so strongly the element of encounter in the production of alternative knowledge forms, and to emphasise that there are, if you like, different types of alternative knowledges in the world to the mainstream knowledge formation. They include indigenous knowledge, but indigenous knowledge itself is not static, and the appeal to it is not necessarily nostalgic. One can think, for instance, of the Aboriginal art, contemporary Aboriginal art in Australia is very creative reworking of traditions rather than an attempt to settle back into a past. The Kaupapa Maori Knowledge Project in Aotearoa, New Zealand, is also a classic example of a future-oriented, community-based, ground-up knowledge project, which indeed uses Maori language and Maori views of the world, but very much to create a new future for the Maori people rather than to settle into an imagined past. So, to me, that criticism, which certainly applies to some constructions of tradition, nevertheless misses the main power of knowledge formation in a decolonial mode, if you like.
So there's a distinction then between wishing to reclaim an imagined past, but taking seriously the past that produces the present.
Yeah, and the cultural resources that gives to marginalised or subordinated people.
But one of the things that I think I'd be interested to hear more from you in relation to the issue of Australia, because you talk about Australia sort of briefly within the paper as well, is that there doesn't seem to be a proper reckoning of Australia as a settler colony, and the cultural encounter was less a cultural encounter than a genocide and a dispossession and an appropriation of land. And so to talk about Deakin, for example, as a Creole, I find problematic in that he may have been a Creole in the UK, given that he was a white British character born in Australia and being formed by Australia. And if he goes to the UK, he could be seen as a Creole. But in the Australian context, he's a settler colonist. And so his relationship to Aboriginals and others is in the context of those particular processes. And I feel that there's a slight romanticisation of Australia within your presentation that doesn't fully engage with the genocidal aspects of
that could
Australia
well be.
as a project.
That's quite possible. That's a risk that I'm doubtless in as a member of the settler colonial population. I was using Creole there in a fairly specific way to mean members of the settler colonial, or the colonising population who are actually born in the colony. And that is a term that can be used both for colonies of conquest and settler colonialism in much the same sense, hence my examples including Sorowana in Mexico, as well as a character like Deakin. If you take Creole to mean something different, someone who's culturally hybridized, then Deakin certainly is not. He is, someone who was formed. For those of you who don't know this bit of Australian history, Deakin was the second Prime Minister of Australia, and really the only intellectual who's ever been Prime Minister of Australia. Quite an interesting character. and illustrative of a kind of progressive liberalism in the colonial circumstances, which was entirely addressed to the settler colonial population and treated the indigenous population very much as a form of wildlife of no concern to the political mainstream.
Just to interrupt, I mean, what does it mean to call him a progressive liberal when in the context Australia didn't recognise Aboriginals as humans?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, wasn't it until about sort of very late into the 20th century that Aboriginals were actually recognised as humans and were enslaved and chained and bonded and forced into labour in particular ways? So you have this sort of labour policy within Australia which shackles Aboriginal peoples and forces them to work on plantations in a very similar form that you had in terms of enslavement in the US. So I find it odd to call him a progressive liberal.
Yeah, that's what he was regarded as at the time. But you have to understand it as entirely within the framework of settler colonial politics.
But the settler colony is a broader, the settler colony is on land that is already inhabited by others.
Sure.
So we can't think in the terms that people may have thought in the past. I mean, I don't buy that argument straightforwardly that those were their terms and so on, because there would have been critique and resistance of that at that time as well. And we're effacing that if we say, oh, well, that was just how people thought in the past, because it certainly wasn't. There was critique there.
Sure. And interestingly, some of the critique of the settler treatment of the Aborigines, some of the strongest critique there came from political conservatives within the framework of settler colonial politics. That is, people who were accepted strong class divisions, were aligned politically with the interests of the rich, whereas characters like Deakin were more aligned with the interests of the colonial working class. I mean, I don't want to spend a lot of time on Australian colonial history, but in fact very few Aboriginal people were actually drawn into the settler economy as a colonised labour force in the way that you saw in South Africa, in India, in much of Latin America. The story was rather more like that in Canada and the United States, where the main relationship between the two was genocidal. In fact, the Aboriginal population fell by 2/3 in the first century of colonisation. Just an enormous number of deaths and displacement. You later got certain use of Aboriginal labour in specific parts of the country and specific industries, but it wasn't the principal relationship. So it's actually a very dramatic example of genocidal settler colonialism.
Do you want to open it up? Okay, so then the last, I guess, question I was interested in, that the essay moves between a consideration of colonialism and a consideration of neoliberalism, but it doesn't really talk about the relationship between them. And I was wondering whether you'd sort of had any thoughts in terms of what that relationship would be, because there's a...
It's an important question, one that I haven't fully got my bearings on. I have been doing some work on neoliberalism and particularly trying to think neoliberalism from the global periphery. So I've been looking at some of the theorists of neoliberalism in Latin America and Africa, even a little bit in India, and relate that rethinking to the experiences of a settler colonial society like Australia. And there's actually some very interesting parallels, so that when the first neoliberal regime in the world got going, that was the Chilean dictatorship under Pinochet, which went neoliberal in the mid-1970s. What was fundamentally involved was a shift of development strategy from an attempt to create a balanced industrialised economy on what was then thought to be the model of the global north. And that was a development strategy of import replacement industrialisation that had been seen around the periphery in the generation before, including in India. towards a strategy of search for comparative advantage in global markets, i.e. search for export staples. And there are very different versions of that in different parts of the periphery. Some developing states found the comparative advantage in cheap labour. Some have found it in minerals, some found it in commercial agriculture. That was Chile, both of those. And Australia did very much the same. Well, Chile and Australia are both in various ways settler colonial states. Brazil, which has a much more complicated ethnic history, of course, moved in the same direction. South Africa, which is still indigenous majority, moved in the same direction, especially after the fall of apartheid. There seems some common ground between different peripheral states in their construction of a neoliberal development strategy, which seems a little bit independent of whether they're settler colonial states or not. That's more or less as far as I've got, except for the general point, of course, that as a neoliberal global economy has formed and acquired, as it now has, very considerable coercive power over states and economies in the global periphery, something that's in important ways analogous to the old empires of conquest has come into existence. So although the precise terms in which we have to do the theorising must change, nevertheless the concerns that come out of analysing the old imperial structures are very much with us today.